Do you believe that sometimes history is not written in words, but in silent spaces? A wedding photograph from 1912, taken in Newport, Rhode Island, seems like just a happy memory in an upper-class family. Everyone is smiling. Everyone is radiant. But in that picture, there is an unfamiliar face, someone who shouldn't be there. Historians have traced and discovered that behind the glamorous facade of the Whitmore family, there is a woman hidden, imprisoned, and almost erased from the family's memory. Tonight, we will open that doorstep through the dust of time and listen to a story that has never been fully told. A story of memory, of family secrets, and of a voice that seemed to have disappeared forever. Sarah Chen adjusted her magnifying glass as the afternoon light streamed through the windows of the Henderson Estate Appraisal Office in Newport, Rhode Island. The fall of 2023 had brought something unusual, a number of families selling off their ancestral collections. And today's date promised to be even more special. Dorothy Whitmore, an elegant woman in her 70s, carefully removed the silk cloth to reveal a large framed photograph. "This has been in our family for over a century," she said in her old-fashioned New England accent. "This is my great-grandmother Margaret's wedding photo taken in 1912. Sarah held her breath as the photo appeared. A seemingly perfect wedding portrait from the Gilded Age. In the foreground, a gorgeous bride in an elaborate lace gown stood beside a dashing groom. Behind her stood a crowd of elegant guests, all smiling brightly for the camera. Whitmore Estate. Dorothy continued, her eyes shining with pride. One of Newport's most magnificent summer houses, 42 rooms overlooking the Atlantic. My great-grandmother Margaret came from a very wealthy family. Sarah nodded, scanning the details with her magnifying glass. The photograph was truly extraordinary. Every pearl on the necklace, every glittering embroidery on the guest's gown, even the carvings on the castle wall in the distance, all still astonishingly clear after more than 100 years. "Absolutely stunning," Sarah whispered, making a note for the appraisal. But then, as the magnifying glass passed over the third floor of the house behind her, she paused. Her heart beat faster. In the small, barely visible window, there was a figure. In contrast to the bustling atmosphere below, the figure seemed pressed tightly against the glass, its posture forlorn. Sarah glanced at Dorothy, who continued to admire the photograph, seemingly oblivious to the oddity. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sarah whispered, "may I take a closer look?" She held the digital magnifier to the photograph. The figure on the screen became clearer. A woman, wearing a translucent white dress like a nightgown or a formal gown. "Is something wrong?" dear Dorothy asked, noticing the appraiser's intense concentration. "Can you tell me what the third floor of the mansion is for?" Dorothy's face changed slightly, as if a cloud had passed by. "The third floor is just the family quarters. Bedroom's living room. Nothing special." Her hand gently turned the pearl necklace around her neck. "Why do you ask?" Sarah turned the screen toward her. "In this doorway, there's a shadow of a person. Do you see it?" Dorothy leaned in close, squinting. For a brief moment, her face paled. She leaned back in her chair, her hand on her chest. I don't know what you're talking about." But Sarah saw the flash of recognition in the older woman's eyes. Something was being hidden. "In my experience," Sarah said softly, Unexpected details like this often reveal a whole family story. Sometimes a loved one is seriously ill and can't attend the wedding, or someone chooses to hide to avoid all eyes. Dorothy was silent for a long time, her eyes never leaving the photograph. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper. In our family, there were things that were never spoken of. Dorothy whispered, her eyes welling with tears. You must understand, in 1912, people viewed mental illness differently. Family honor always came first. Sarah's heart beat faster. This was the kind of secret hidden in old photographs that she had always longed to discover. If you're comfortable, she said softly, I'd love to hear more. Sometimes the context makes a photograph priceless. Dorothy glanced around the room as if afraid someone might be listening. There was a woman in the family, Eleanor. She was my Uncle James's wife. After the birth of their first child and the untimely death of her, she was never the same again. The pieces began to fit together in Sarah's mind. She made notes, keeping an encouraging look for Dorothy to continue. Eleanor Whitmore was a very distinguished woman, Dorothy said shakily. She went to Vaasa, spoke 3 languages, was the pride of Newport. But after the loss of her child, she was kept on the 3rd floor of the mansion. For everyone's safety. Sarah quickly looked it up on the tablet. What year did she get married? 1910, Dorothy replied. The baby died in early 1911. By the summer of 1912, when Margaret was married, Eleanor was already confined on the 3rd floor. The results that appeared on the screen confirmed Dorothy's words. Public records showed that Eleanor Whitmore had been declared incompetent by the state of Rhode Island in late 1911. She was only 23. The family called it a mental disorder. Dorothy continued. In those days, what we now know as postpartum depression was often seen as madness. Women were sent to hospitals, or if they were wealthy, kept in their homes under constant surveillance. Sarah turned back to the photograph. The figure in the window was clearer now. A young woman in a simple white dress seemed to be pressing herself against the glass, trying to look down at the joy in the yard below. Will she ever recover? Sarah asked softly. Dorothy shook her head, her face somber. That's the saddest part. I've read in my grandmother's old letters. Eleanor would have moments of lucidity. She wrote poems, painted pictures, begged to be allowed down to be with her family. But James and her doctor always said any emotional outburst would make her worse. Sarah took note of every detail, replaying the scene. A bright young woman locked up high, while the rest of the family laughed below. Just think, Dorothy asked softly, a woman in her 20s full of life, standing up there, watching her life pass by just a few floors down. Could there be anything crueler? The photograph, once so full of light and joy, suddenly took on a new meaning, a shadow creeping into the wedding party. Mrs. Whitmore, Sarah said after a moment of silence, I want to delve deeper. Stories like this deserve to be told. Dorothy sat thoughtfully. What would that entail? 3 days later, Sarah was in the basement of the Newport Historical Society. The room smelled of old paper and leather and dusty boxes lined up. She began to flip through the Whitmore files and quickly discovered details that weighed heavily on her heart. A trove of private family correspondence revealed a connection between James Whitmore and Dr. Harrison Mills, a self-proclaimed expert on female neuroses. Sarah flipped through each letter, taking pictures on her phone. Each line made her more indignant: complete isolation from social stimulation, restriction of reading or writing, and when emotional impulses arise, must be restrained by physical restraint. But it was Eleanor's letters that made Sarah's heart ache. Hidden in the files was a stack of letters, never sent Eleanor's words to her sister in Boston. Dear Catherine, a letter dated just 2 weeks before the wedding began. I looked out the window and saw the gardeners getting ready for the big day. I longed to wear a pretty dress to feel the sun on my face, to dance with my husband like I used to. But James said I wasn't strong enough, that joy would make me dangerous. Sarah paused, looking up at the small window where the fading afternoon light was filtering in. Eleanor's handwriting was soft and clear. Her thoughts were clear. No sign of madness, only deep sadness and loneliness. Another letter written just after the wedding was even more heartbreaking. The party was exactly as I had imagined. Eleanor wrote in a letter that was never sent. I heard the orchestra in the garden, saw the ladies in their bright dresses. Margaret, so radiant in her ivory lace. I pressed my face against the glass, hoping someone would look up. Someone would remember that I was part of this family too. But no, I was invisible, as I had always been. Sarah wiped away a tear, then continued to photograph the documents. Before her lay Eleanor's medical records, cold words that pathologized grief and turned a young woman into a case to be hidden. Dr. Mills's notes described her as prone to melancholy and hysteria. But the treatments were not meant to cure her, but to keep her out of the public eye. Sarah's phone rang. A message from Dorothy. Any progress? I've been thinking about Eleanor all week. A lot, Sarah replied. Her story is tragic but important. Would you be willing to meet me tomorrow? The answer came immediately. Yes, it's time for the family to know the truth. The next day, Sarah met Dorothy in a quiet cafe in downtown Newport. Outside, the autumn wind tapped gently against the glass windows. She set her laptop and a stack of photocopies on the table. I need to warn you, Sarah began, her voice slow. What I found will probably upset you. The way they treated Eleanor by today's standards was atrocious. Dorothy nodded, her eyes flashing with concern. I always suspected there was something, but the family never said anything. Sarah turned the screen toward her, revealing Dr. Harrison Mills's treatment notes. She was not insane as they said. The symptoms: she was experiencing depression, withdrawal, occasional emotional outbursts were signs of complicated grief after the loss of a child. But instead of being listened to, she was considered a danger. She handed over more documents. Dr. Mills was trained in what was called moral treatment for women, but it was really a brutal experiment. He prescribed chloral hydrate, kept her immobile for weeks, and forbade any mental activity. No reading, no drawing, no writing. Everything she loved was considered overstimulating. Dorothy glanced shakily at a hidden letter from Eleanor. I tried to persuade James, saying I felt better when I read or draw. But Dr. Mills insisted that mental activity would make me worse. Now, I just stare out the window, watching the world go on without me. Sarah sighed softly. The heartbreaking thing is, she was completely sane. Every word showed understanding clarity about the pain she was going through. But just because she was a woman, just because she had lost a child, all her emotions were labeled as sick. Dorothy sat silently for a long time, her eyes moist. Then she whispered, "So when that photo was taken, Eleanor was truly a prisoner in her own home. Looking down at the wedding ceremony while locked up there, drugs clouding her mind." "That's right," Sarah nodded. "And according to this file, it lasted for years." She hesitated for a moment, then continued. "Dorothy, I also found the death certificate. Eleanor died in 1919, only 30 years old, still imprisoned on the 3rd floor. The cause was listed as nervous exhaustion. But with the amount of medication she was taking and the confinement, perhaps..." Dorothy closed her eyes, her voice choking. She never recovered, because she was never allowed to recover. Sarah nodded slightly. "That's right. Eleanor was not only a victim of the medical beliefs of the time, but also abandoned by her own family, who considered her honor more important than her life." Dorothy leaned back in her chair, thinking, her voice trembling slightly. What are we to do with this? That afternoon, Dorothy returned to the simple old house she had inherited from her grandmother. But in every room, every wall, now echoed a heavy story, the story of Eleanor, a young woman forgotten on the 3rd floor of a lavish mansion. "Did anything come of this letter?" Sarah asked quietly. Dr. Walsh shook her head, her expression somber. The medical society acknowledged receipt, but took no action. Mills had an impeccable reputation among Newport's elite families. Catherine's plea was essentially ignored. Sarah sat back, struggling to process the weight of it all. So Eleanor's own sister tried to intervene, yet even her voice was dismissed. "Exactly," Dr. Walsh replied. "It reveals not just medical negligence, but a social system that silenced women on every level." Eleanor's tragedy wasn't simply personal, it was systemic. As Sarah packed away her notes, she couldn't stop thinking about Catherine. A woman who had seen her sister suffering with clear eyes, who had put pen to paper in defense of her, only to be met with silence. That letter was proof that Eleanor had at least one ally, someone who believed her. Later, Sarah shared this discovery with Dorothy and the rest of the family. The revelation deepened their grief, but also strengthened their resolve. Catherine's unheard letter became for them a symbol of what must change now, over a century later. Dorothy's voice trembled as she spoke to the family. If Catherine's words were ignored, then maybe we can finally make them heard now. 6 months later, Sarah stood quietly in the main gallery of the Newport Historical Society, her eyes drifting over the faces of visitors as they paused before the display cases. The exhibition had been titled "Hidden Lives, Women's Mental Health in Gilded Age Newport." At its center, beneath soft light and protective glass, rested Eleanor's small leather journal, its fragile pages now carrying the weight of truth across more than a century. Nearby, the 1912 wedding photograph hung enlarged, the faint figure in the upstairs window, now labeled Eleanor Whitmore, 1889-1919. Confined but not silenced. Visitors leaned in close, searching the photograph with new awareness, some whispering as if afraid to disturb her memory. Panels of text explained not only Eleanor's story, but the broader history of women whose grief, intelligence, or independence had been mistaken for illness. Artifacts from similar cases line the walls, bottles of chloral hydrate medical journals praising rest. Cures letters from women pleading to be heard. Dorothy stood beside her granddaughter Emma, watching a group of high school students linger over Eleanor's poetry, reproduced on the wall in delicate script. Emma whispered, "She finally got her audience." Sarah felt a quiet satisfaction, but also a lingering ache. Eleanor had never walked out of that third-floor room, never held her son at his funeral, never danced again at a celebration. And yet, through her words, she had reached across the decades to this moment. She had, in the end, told a story. Dorothy placed a hand on the glass case, her voice soft but resolute. "You're not invisible anymore, Eleanor. We see you now." The centerpiece of the exhibition is the 1912 wedding photograph, the one that once evoked so many questions about the shadowy face in the window. Now it is set in a completely new setting, surrounded by Eleanor's diaries, letters, and medical records. Dorothy has decided to hand over all of her diaries and family documents to create a permanent archive. Dr. Walsh has contributed extensive research on Dr. Mills and a host of similar cases. But most important are Eleanor's own words. For the first time, viewers can understand her story, not through the lens of another, but through the whispering voice of a woman who has been robbed of her voice. The exhibition's opening day attracted national attention. Medical historians, feminists, and descendants of other Newport families have come not only to remember Eleanor, but also to learn from her pain. In the quiet, Emma, now 17, stands next to a plaque she wrote. Eleanor Whitmore was a victim of her times, but also a survivor. Her story reminds us that behind every injustice in history are real people who suffered, who resisted, and who still hope for a better tomorrow. Sarah saw a young mother reading Eleanor's poems to her daughter, saying they had been kept only in memory when all the books were taken away. An elderly man stood for a long time in front of medical records, then turned to Sarah and told her that his grandmother had been imprisoned in the same way in the 1920s. Dorothy stepped forward holding a bouquet of white roses. "The family has decided to put a memorial at Eleanor's grave," she said quietly. "We discovered she was buried in an unmarked plot in the family cemetery. That will change." Dr. Walsh began to expand her research throughout New England, and Eleanor became the catalyst for a major investigation into how women were treated in early 20th century medicine. "What's unique about this case is that we have her own account," she told the press. She recorded her lucidity and resistance, leaving behind evidence that challenges the claims of the medical community. Michael, through his legal efforts, succeeded in having Eleanor's guardianship reviewed, albeit symbolically. And when the court acknowledged that she had been wrongly declared incompetent, it was the first time justice had formally acknowledged the failure of a system that was supposed to protect her. In the late afternoon, as the guests had thinned out, Sarah stood alone in front of the wedding photo. This time, the face in the window no longer held the mysterious, haunting look. It was simply Eleanor, a young woman longing to join in the joys of family life, but trapped in a prison of prejudice and medical error. Sarah suddenly remembered the last line in her diary. "I believe that one day it will be understood that a mother's grief does not make her insane, that the mind and the heart can coexist in the same person. When that day comes, perhaps my story will help other women avoid my fate." The day has finally come. After 111 years, Elena's buried voice has been heard. The wedding photo, once a symbol of a family secret, is now a powerful reminder that we must listen to women, trust their experiences, and never underestimate the power of survival and human dignity, even in the darkest of circumstances. Elena Whitmore, after more than a century of waiting, has finally been given justice.